The day Rob Reiner and Michelle Singer Reiner were found lifeless in their Brentwood home was the beginning of a sorrow that no public attention could truly capture. The world saw the loss of a legendary director, a socially conscious couple whose work had touched countless lives, yet inside the quiet walls of their family home, grief took on a shape far more intimate, far more harrowing. Their children, Jake, Romy, and Nick, faced a reality that would redefine the meaning of loss. The funeral, held privately in a Jewish tradition that valued swift and respectful rites, gave the siblings only a fleeting moment to hold their parents close. Jake, the eldest, carried the weight of being the official informant, receiving the ashes that seemed to carry not just the remains, but the immense legacy of lives lived with purpose. Even as they navigated the somber corridors of the mortuary, every glance, every silence, echoed with the enormity of what had just occurred. Weeks later, the shock deepened when the contents of the will were revealed. Nearly $200 million of a fortune painstakingly built over decades of creativity, strategic investments, and relentless dedication had been directed entirely toward charitable foundations. For Jake and Romy, the initial disbelief turned into an aching, confusing sense of being excluded from their own family story. The grief of losing their parents shifted into a more complicated mix of sadness and frustration, a feeling of having been pushed out of the narrative that had always defined their lives. Calls to lawyers followed swiftly, a desperate attempt to navigate the new reality, to find some foothold amid the emotional turbulence. Romy moved silently, eyes heavy with sorrow, while Jake projected an outward intensity, his protective posture almost shielding his sister from the prying eyes of a world ready to witness their private grief. The media, though absent from the funeral, quickly converged on the family's movements. Photographs of Romy and Jake entering a prestigious Beverly Hills law firm spread across the internet, accompanied by dramatic headlines speculating about inheritance battles. The public could not know that this was not a story of greed, but a deeply personal confrontation with philosophy, love, and understanding. Rob Reiner had long emphasized independence, teaching his children that wealth should never define their worth. Money, he believed, could be a burden if it replaced personal responsibility, and his decision reflected a lifetime of valuing purpose over possession. The very fortune that might have symbolized comfort and familial connection now became a source of profound emotional turmoil, a visible representation of choices rooted in principle rather than sentimentality. Inside the law offices, the gravity of the situation weighed on every word and gesture. Jake and Romy consulted with attorneys known for handling Hollywood estates, each conversation a delicate negotiation between respect for their parents' intent and the need to reconcile their own pain. The documents, emails, and personal notes of their parents became both evidence and a means to understand a life philosophy they were only beginning to grasp. Romy's tears and Jake's quiet intensity were not signs of greed, but expressions of a deep, almost physical longing for connection to the parents they had loved so dearly. The realization that their parents had deliberately chosen the world over the immediate family created an emotional fissure that no court could entirely address. Even as the world celebrated Rob Reiner for his generosity and activism, inside the family, a storm brewed. The children had to reconcile the nobility of their parents' intentions with the raw experience of exclusion. Rob's lifelong commitment to charitable causes, from early childhood education foundations to advocacy for civil rights and equality, was exemplary, but it collided with the intimate need for parental presence and support, leaving a complex emotional landscape to navigate. The wealth that had allowed Rob to shape so many lives was now both a symbol of his vision and a barrier to the tangible connection his children craved. Through the quiet weeks that followed, Jake and Romy walked a path lined with memories and unspoken lessons. Every artifact in the Brentwood home, every photograph and keepsake became a reminder of the philosophy their parents had imparted not in words but through action. They learned that love could manifest in unexpected ways, that the ultimate expression of care might come as a challenge, a test, or even a painful omission meant to teach resilience. The absence of material inheritance forced them to confront the essence of their upbringing, the core values of independence, accountability, and self-reliance that Rob had sought to instill. As they processed the shock, the siblings realized that understanding their parents' decisions required an appreciation of a lifetime of principles applied with precision and compassion. Rob and Michelle had lived with the awareness that their legacy extended beyond their own family, touching countless lives through film, philanthropy, and activism. The same devotion that built an empire of creativity and influence also demanded difficult choices for those closest to them. Jake and Romy, in the depth of their grief, began to see that this was a final lesson. The greatest inheritance is not always material, and love can sometimes be expressed through absence, through the challenge of stepping into the world independently, and through the quiet strength cultivated over years of thoughtful guidance. Jake and Romy Reiner found themselves walking through the quiet halls of their Brentwood home in the days following the funeral, each step echoing with the weight of memories and the absence of the voices they had grown up with. Every object in the house seemed to carry a story, a fragment of a life lived at the intersection of creativity, responsibility, and unwavering principles. Childhood photographs lined the walls, capturing moments of laughter and tenderness. Yet now they felt distant, almost surreal. The lessons their parents had instilled were woven into the very fabric of their upbringing, subtle but persistent, visible in the way they had been guided to navigate challenges without reliance on material comfort. The warmth of their childhood home was now tinged with the cold reality of absence, and each room served as a reminder of what had been lost. Not only their parents, but the tangible connection to the lives that had shaped them. Growing up in the Reiner household had been both a blessing and a crucible. Rob Reiner, as a father, had been a man of principle, instilling in his children a profound sense of responsibility and self-reliance. From an early age, Jake had been encouraged to make decisions, to face the consequences of his actions, and to understand that personal growth came through experience, not inheritance. Romy, equally observant, had been guided to pursue her passions with discipline, to understand that talent alone was insufficient without perseverance and thoughtful action. The values their parents taught were reinforced through small, deliberate gestures, a carefully timed correction, a conversation about fairness, or a quiet observation of character during moments of triumph and failure alike. There was no overt lecture, no rigid expectation of obedience, only an unspoken structure, a moral architecture that framed the way they would perceive the world and themselves. Their mother, Michelle Singer Reiner, complemented Rob's approach with a quiet, strategic intelligence. She had been the orchestrator behind many of the couple's philanthropic initiatives, a mind attuned to detail and long-term vision. Romy and Jake had witnessed her tirelessly coordinating with donors, managing budgets, and negotiating with stakeholders, often without any public acknowledgement. Michelle's presence was a lesson in the subtle power of perseverance, in the importance of thinking several steps ahead while remaining grounded in ethical responsibility. The children absorbed these lessons as part of their environment, learning the intricate balance of influence and integrity and the necessity of aligning personal ambition with a broader sense of purpose. As they navigated the weeks following the revelation of the will, memories of their parents' professional and philanthropic lives mingled with the private, intimate lessons of childhood. Rob's philosophy had always been clear in principle. Independence is the ultimate gift, wealth can be a distraction, and true character is measured by how one faces adversity. Yet the manifestation of that philosophy in the form of a will that excluded them from inheritance created a profound cognitive dissonance. Jake and Romy were forced to confront the reality that the same values that had guided them for decades were now being expressed in a form that caused immediate emotional pain. The lesson, once theoretical, had become visceral, tangible, and inescapable. The Reiner children had long understood that their parents' lives were defined by a commitment to others beyond the family. Rob's career as an actor and director was intertwined with an acute awareness of social responsibility. His work with Castle Rock Entertainment, producing culturally significant films and series, had provided a platform for storytelling that informed, challenged, and inspired audiences. Simultaneously, Rob and Michelle had invested themselves in causes that range from early childhood education to civil rights, creating foundations that would endure beyond their lifetimes. The children grew up witnessing the intersection of personal passion and societal impact, learning that success was not solely a measure of recognition or financial gain, but of the ability to effect lasting change. Yet within this environment of achievement and altruism, there had also been tension, subtle and pervasive. The pressure to internalize these values while pursuing personal growth created moments of internal conflict. Romy remembered the nights spent grappling with creative projects, questioning whether her efforts were sufficient in the shadow of her parents' accomplishments. Jake recalled moments when responsibility weighed heavily, when the expectations implicit in a household committed to impact and integrity felt like both guidance and restraint. The Reiner household was a space where love was abundant, but often expressed through high expectations and ethical rigor rather than overt emotional indulgence. Now, confronted with the lessons of childhood collided with the stark realities of adult grief. The absence of financial inheritance forced Jake and Romy to reflect deeply on the intentions of their parents. They began to see that Rob's insistence on independence was not abstract. It was the culmination of a lifetime of observing their strengths, acknowledging their maturity, and trusting in their ability to navigate life without dependence on material advantage. Each philanthropic endeavor, each strategic decision in the management of wealth, each conversation about responsibility was now contextualized as preparation for this moment, a final demonstration of faith in their capabilities. The siblings spent hours poring over photographs, letters, and personal journals, revisiting the textures of their upbringing and the choices that had defined their parents' lives. Every anecdote, every recollection became a thread in the tapestry of understanding. They began to recognize the foresight in decisions that once seemed harsh or incomprehensible. Rob and Michelle had structured their lives and their legacies not merely to benefit society, but to cultivate resilience, independence, and purpose in their children. The material absence they now confronted was a deliberate, albeit painful, extension of these lessons, a real-world challenge that mirrored the abstract principles they had absorbed through observation and example. Through this lens, Jake and Romy started to see the depth of the sacrifices their parents had made. Rob had amassed a fortune that could have provided comfort, luxury, and security. Yet he chose to channel that wealth into initiatives that would touch countless lives, prioritizing societal impact over familial convenience. Michelle, coordinating quietly but effectively, ensured that every dollar, every project reflected thoughtful intent and tangible benefit. The children began to understand that the wealth they had been denied was never intended as a measure of love or neglect, but as a tool for teaching endurance, independence, and the capacity to confront life's realities with courage. In the quiet moments, when the public eye was absent, Romy and Jake grappled with the emotional weight of these realizations. The sense of betrayal, the pangs of loss, and the challenge of reconciling principle with personal hurt formed a complex emotional landscape. They moved through the home and the memories of their upbringing, piecing together the mosaic of guidance, expectation, and love that Rob and Michelle had constructed. Each reflection was tinged with sorrow, yet also with a growing understanding. The true inheritance of their parents was not in dollars or property, but in the lessons embedded in the very fabric of their lives, lessons of integrity, resilience, and purposeful living. In the weeks following their parents' passing, Jake and Romy Reiner faced a series of realities that no lesson from childhood could have fully prepared them for. The world outside observed from a distance, their curiosity piqued by the headlines, the gossip, the occasional paparazzi snapshot. But inside the confines of legal offices and quiet conference rooms, the siblings navigated an emotional terrain that was as intricate and fraught as any film Rob had ever directed. The revelation of the will had created not merely a question of finances, but a crisis of identity, a confrontation with the very principles and philosophies that had guided their upbringing. The fortune that might have symbolized security and connection was absent, redirected toward charitable causes that were noble in intention, yet agonizing in impact for those left behind. Every step into the Beverly Hills law firm was a deliberate act, a movement weighed down by grief, confusion, and the need for answers. Jake's expression, taut with the memory of loss, radiated a protective intensity toward Romy, who moved with quiet, restrained sorrow. The weight of expectation, of responsibility, and of immediate grief converged in their posture and demeanor, silent testimony to the duality of their experience. The devastation of losing parents and the sudden, incomprehensible exclusion from the tangible legacy of their lives. Lawyers, accustomed to high-profile estates, watched the siblings carefully, noting the unspoken urgency in their questions, the barely contained emotions beneath composed surfaces. The contents of the will were, on paper, an act of profound altruism. Nearly all of the estimated $200 million of wealth, accumulated through decades of acting, directing, producing, and strategic investments, have been allocated to charitable foundations chosen by Rob and Michelle. For an outside observer, it was a story of generosity and public-minded vision. For Jake and Romy, it was a collision of principle and pain, a tangible manifestation of absence. The funds, the homes, the properties, and the earnings that might have symbolized parental support were now instruments of societal good. Yet to the siblings, each dollar was a reminder of the parental presence that could no longer be reached, of the familial connection that had been redirected. Romy, who had spent her life cultivating creative projects under the quiet encouragement of her parents, felt the sting of being erased from what she considered her own family narrative. Jake, with a career already established and personal independence proven, confronted an anger that was both raw and complicated. Frustration that their parents' care for the broader world had overridden immediate familial bonds. Their emotions were not greed-driven. They were human, visceral, a response to a fundamental sense of displacement. This was compounded by the sudden thrust into legal proceedings, where every detail of the will, every clause, every decision made decades prior, became a focus of scrutiny and challenge. Inside the offices, the siblings began to confront a reality that was far more intricate than simply contesting a will. They explored trust structures, timing, potential ambiguities, and the specific mechanisms that directed assets to charitable organizations. Discussions were intense, sometimes silent, as they absorbed the scope of the decisions their parents had made, decisions grounded in decades of philosophical thinking about independence, responsibility, and the role of wealth. Every question asked, every document examined, became a means of piecing together not just legal strategy, but understanding, a desperate attempt to reconcile love and principle, grief and philosophy. The siblings also had to grapple with public perception. Reporters swarmed outside the offices, cameras flashing, questions shouted across hallways. Each inquiry about inheritance, validation of the will, or temporary control over the assets felt disconnected from the personal gravity of the situation. Jake and Romy had to navigate this intrusion while processing their own sorrow and disorientation. Romy's silence was a shield, a means of maintaining composure amidst the chaos, while Jake's protective posture was a visible boundary between public scrutiny and private anguish. The media's interpretations, often sensationalized, did little to illuminate the personal crisis at hand, instead highlighting the drama of a high-profile inheritance dispute in the world of Hollywood. Despite the external spectacle, the siblings' confrontation with the reality of the will was intimate, painful, and immediate. Rob had believed that wealth could sometimes hinder growth, that his children needed the crucible of real-life experience to cultivate resilience and self-reliance. Nick, who had faced personal challenges over the years, was seen by Rob as someone who needed to navigate life without the cushion of inherited wealth. Jake and Romy had demonstrated independence, proving capable of managing their own paths, yet the emotional impact of being excluded from material inheritance was undeniable. The absence, though rooted in intention and principle, cut deeply, leaving the siblings to contend with grief intensified by the perceived omission. As they began to strategize legally, assembling a team of expert attorneys in the field of celebrity estates, the emotional stakes were ever present. Meetings were charged, conversations intense, and the balance between understanding parental philosophy and confronting the tangible consequences of exclusion required constant negotiation. Krause and Hartman, seasoned in complex estate disputes, advised on both the legal possibilities and the likely challenges, noting that contesting charitable allocations could provoke public backlash, alter perceptions of the family, and impact the reputation of the parents posthumously. Jake and Romy, however, were undeterred. Their pursuit was not for mere monetary gain, but for acknowledgement, for dialogue, for the chance to process the choices of the parents they had loved within a framework that could provide clarity and reconciliation. Throughout this period, the siblings had to continuously reconcile two realities. One was the public image of their parents, celebrated, philanthropic, committed to societal good, a legacy broadcast through headlines and social media. The other was intensely personal, the absence of material inheritance and the sense of disconnection from the physical manifestations of parental love and guidance. Each negotiation, each legal discussion, each reflection on their upbringing became a method of navigating these dual truths. The will, with its redirection of wealth, became a prism through which they examined their parents' principles, intentions, and the philosophical underpinnings of a lifetime dedicated to impact and purpose. In the quiet, away from cameras and reporters, the siblings confronted the emotional complexity of their inheritance struggle. Every memory of childhood, every recollection of parental guidance, every lesson absorbed silently through observation, now served as context for understanding a decision that might otherwise have seemed unthinkable. Rob and Michelle's choices were not acts of neglect, but expressions of a worldview that prized independence, accountability, and social responsibility above material provision. For Jake and Romy, processing this reality was a delicate, ongoing journey, one where grief, anger, understanding, and acceptance intertwined, forming a narrative as intricate and compelling as any cinematic story their father had ever brought to life. In the weeks that followed the revelation of Rob Reiner's will, the emotional toll on Jake and Romy deepened in ways that went far beyond financial concerns. The absence of inheritance created a vacuum where grief, confusion, and frustration collided. Every day became a negotiation with their own hearts, a constant confrontation with feelings that were as raw as the moment they had first discovered the contents of the will. The siblings were forced to navigate not only the logistics of legal consultations and estate planning, but also the internal reckoning of a love expressed through absence rather than provision. The act of directing decades of accumulated wealth toward charitable causes, while noble, left an indelible mark on the family psyche, creating a tension between principle and personal longing that would not be easily resolved. The emotional impact was immediate and pervasive. Jake wrestled with a storm of feelings that alternated between anger, sadness, and a profound sense of being abandoned. He could not ignore the injustice he felt. The fortune his parents had painstakingly built over a lifetime had been placed in hands that were strangers to him, while the children who had grown up under their guidance were excluded. Romy, quieter in expression but equally affected, experienced a subtler grief that manifested in introspection, sleepless nights, and an acute awareness of the void left behind by the absence of material acknowledgement of their parents' love. Both siblings were grappling with a paradox, understanding the intentions of Rob and Michelle while simultaneously feeling erased from the tangible legacy of their lives. The public, unaware of the intricacies of family dynamics, observed with curiosity and, in some cases, judgment. Headlines highlighted a dramatic inheritance dispute, portraying the siblings as challenging a charitable intent, while the emotional reality was far more complex. Jake and Romy were not seeking to undermine their parents' philanthropic vision. They were attempting to reconcile grief, principle, and the yearning for connection. Each meeting with lawyers involved careful deliberation, a balance between honoring the charitable goals their parents had championed and seeking acknowledgement of the personal loss and exclusion they had experienced. Legal preparations became a daily ritual, a means of translating emotional turmoil into structured action. The siblings reviewed documents, questioned the timing of trust allocations, and explored the potential for legal nuances that might provide clarity or, at the very least, a sense of agency in a situation over which they had little control. Each consultation was emotionally charged, as they navigated the delicate balance of advocating for themselves without diminishing the integrity of the foundations that Rob and Michelle had painstakingly built. Lawyers cautioned about public perception and the potential backlash against challenging charitable allocations. Yet Jake and Romy pressed forward, driven by a need to make sense of their own exclusion and to reconcile the philosophical lessons they had been taught with the tangible consequences they now faced. The personal toll extended beyond strategy sessions and consultations. Romy and Jake found themselves revisiting childhood memories, reflecting on the lessons imparted through observation rather than instruction. They recalled quiet evenings when their parents worked tirelessly on charitable projects, late nights reviewing budgets, negotiating with donors, and coordinating community initiatives. These memories, once comforting, now carried a bittersweet quality, reminding them of the magnitude of their parents' dedication while underscoring the absence of personal inheritance. Every recollection reinforced the duality of their experience, pride in the moral and societal legacy of their parents, alongside an acute sense of personal loss. Interactions with friends and confidants further highlighted the emotional ramifications. Trusted family friends, who had observed the siblings' upbringing, noted the depth of their internal struggle. They described a tension between understanding and resentment, compassion and frustration, as Jake and Romy attempted to process a philosophy of independence enacted in the most tangible and painful manner. Conversations revealed layers of complexity. While the children respected their parents' commitment to society, the lack of personal inclusion in the estate created a profound emotional fracture that colored every interaction, every reflection, and every decision. Even everyday life carried reminders of the absence left behind. Passing through rooms that once echoed with laughter, handling possessions imbued with memories, and walking the streets near their childhood home became exercises in grappling with intangible loss. The wealth that had been absent was symbolic not only of financial inheritance, but of connection, security, and acknowledgement. Each missing element emphasized the reality that love and guidance, though deeply felt, had been expressed in a form that could not fully satisfy the human need for tangible presence. The legal process itself became a crucible for emotional endurance. Jake and Romy confronted attorneys, scrutinized documents, and explored every possible avenue for clarity and understanding. Yet the underlying emotional reality persisted. This was not merely a contest of assets, but a confrontation with grief, betrayal, and the existential questions posed by their parents' decisions. Every step required reconciling respect for Rob and Michelle's lifetime of service and philanthropy with the immediate and personal sense of loss. The siblings were learning that grief is rarely linear, and that understanding intention does not always alleviate pain. In the midst of these struggles, the philosophical underpinning of their parents' choices became both a source of guidance and frustration. Rob had long taught that independence and responsibility were paramount, that material wealth could be a hindrance to personal growth, and that true character emerges through challenge. For Jake and Romy, this principle was no longer abstract. It had become tangible in the form of absence and exclusion. The siblings were forced to embody the lessons their parents had imparted, navigating life without reliance on inheritance, confronting the emotional consequences of autonomy, and seeking ways to honor their parents' vision while processing their own disappointment. Over time, subtle shifts occurred. The initial intensity of grief and anger gave way to moments of reflection, where Jake and Romy could acknowledge the magnitude of Rob and Michelle's contributions to society. The realization that their parents' decisions were rooted in love, expressed through an unwavering commitment to principle rather than through material provision, provided context, if not full comfort. The siblings began to see that their parents' vision extended far beyond the immediate family, encompassing a societal responsibility that had defined their lives. Even as the absence of financial inheritance remained a source of emotional tension, it also became a lens through which they could appreciate the depth and complexity of the Reiner legacy. The impact on personal relationships was equally profound. Interactions with peers, extended family, and friends were colored by the siblings' grief and the public nature of the estate, creating a sense of isolation. The emotional labor of maintaining composure in public, of navigating the scrutiny of journalists and casual observers, added another layer of complexity. Yet within this turmoil, Jake and Romy found moments of clarity, recognition of their own strength, acknowledgement of their parents' lifelong commitment to principle, and the beginnings of an understanding that the inheritance they had truly received was not material, but philosophical, a blueprint for navigating life with integrity, independence, and purpose. In the quiet hours of the evening, after lawyers had left and the formalities of estate consultation had ended, Romy and Jake Reiner would sit in the dimly lit rooms of their Brentwood home, surrounded by the echoes of memory. These moments, unobserved by the public eye, were where the true weight of their loss and confusion settled. Every photograph, every memento, every faint trace of their parents' presence became a reminder of the intimacy they had lost and the invisible guidance they had grown accustomed to. The siblings found themselves tracing back years of subtle instruction, recalling how Rob's lessons and responsibility had been embedded in small, almost imperceptible actions. A glance, a question asked with deliberate neutrality, a decision he allowed them to make independently. Each had been a deliberate exercise in cultivating resilience, and now, these memories took on a new, painful clarity. Romy recalled evenings when she would linger in the kitchen, observing her mother coordinate donations or reconcile discrepancies in budgets for charitable initiatives. Michelle's attention to detail and insistence on accountability had not only ensured the success of their foundations, but had subtly shaped Romy's perception of integrity and responsibility. The late-night conversations, where no words were explicitly about morality, but where every choice was a lesson in discernment, now felt like precious instructions encoded in memory. She remembered watching her father debate passionately with directors and producers, yet always maintaining a quiet reverence for fairness and honesty. Those debates, once confusing to a child, now illuminated the depth of Rob's commitment to principle over convenience, to truth over expedience, a philosophy that had governed the family's private and public life. Jake's recollections were more intertwined with lessons in independence and perseverance. Rob had often positioned him in situations where he had to make choices without immediate guidance, trusting that the consequences themselves would teach more effectively than direct instruction. At the time, these exercises had felt like subtle tests, challenges imposed by a parent whose love was measured in expectations rather than explicit assurances. Now, facing the absence of tangible inheritance, Jake realized that this approach was consistent with a lifetime of subtle preparation. The financial exclusion he felt was, in a sense, the final, inescapable lesson. The world itself would serve as teacher. The siblings' own capacity for judgment and resilience would determine the course of their lives. The siblings also reflected on the quieter, almost invisible ways their parents had modeled compassion and service. They remembered Rob visiting community screenings of educational films, ensuring that each event engaged audiences meaningfully, and Michelle quietly coordinating with legislators, donors, and educators to maximize impact. These actions were not performed for recognition. They were part of a lived philosophy that valued action over appearance, principle over personal gain. Romy and Jake had absorbed these patterns unconsciously, internalizing a framework for ethical action that now seemed inseparable from the very notion of who they were. Yet in the absence of inheritance, these lessons were intertwined with a profound sense of being overlooked, a feeling that love had been expressed in forms they could not grasp through conventional measures. Moments of solitude were often punctuated by memories of seemingly mundane events that now resonated with significance. The way Rob would linger at the end of a conversation, letting children speak their minds fully before responding, was a lesson in listening and reflection. The careful attention Michelle paid to the details of fundraising and logistics demonstrated the value of diligence and precision. In hindsight, each gesture, each instruction through example, had prepared them to face challenges independently. Now, with the estate allocated to causes beyond their reach, these private lessons were the only tangible inheritance left. Even daily routines carried reminders of absence and responsibility. Passing through spaces where family gatherings had once occurred, handling books and notes left by their parents, Romy and Jake experienced a profound duality: pride in the lives their parents had led and the principles they had instilled, paired with the acute pain of being materially excluded from the tangible fruits of that life. The emotional landscape was complicated, grief interlaced with admiration, frustration mingled with respect, and the ordinary moments of reflection became opportunities to assess the full weight of Rob and Michelle's philosophy. The siblings also became increasingly aware of the subtle, yet profound, impact of their parents' decision on their own identities. Being excluded from the fortune forced them to confront the notion of self-sufficiency not as a theoretical ideal, but as a lived necessity. Jake and Romy began to evaluate their own skills, ambitions, and capacities, realizing that independence was no longer a lesson deferred but an immediate imperative. The practical and emotional void left by the inheritance became a mirror, reflecting their own readiness to navigate life without reliance on parental safety nets. This awareness, though initially painful, slowly became a catalyst for personal growth, compelling them to embody the principles Rob and Michelle had sought to instill over decades. Private discussions between the siblings often revolved around reconciling their pain with understanding. Romy would voice doubts and fears about the apparent harshness of exclusion, while Jake would channel his frustration into methodical questioning of legal procedures and the structure of the charitable allocations. In these conversations, they gradually recognized that the absence of financial inheritance was not an act of neglect or malice, but a deliberate embodiment of their parents' lifelong commitment to teaching independence, resilience, and purpose. Even the moments of anger and tears were a testament to their engagement with the values that had been silently communicated throughout their upbringing. Through it all, Jake and Romy began to see the dual nature of Rob and Michelle's legacy. On one hand, there was public acknowledgement and societal impact. Foundations thriving, programs influencing millions, and an enduring record of activism and philanthropy. On the other, there was an intimate, personal lesson about responsibility, self-reliance, and the weight of principles over comfort. This dual legacy, though difficult to process, revealed itself to be as profound and meaningful as any material inheritance could have been. The siblings were learning, in real time, that understanding intention requires both patience and empathy, and that the deepest lessons of a parent's life may be expressed in absence as much as presence. As they revisited old letters, journals, and photographs, Jake and Romy confronted a mixture of sorrow and enlightenment. Each recollection became a stepping stone in reconstructing the narrative of their parents' lives and philosophies. They began to internalize the notion that true inheritance lies not in possession, but in principle, not in wealth, but in wisdom, not in comfort, but in the ability to confront the world with integrity and resilience. The quiet spaces of reflection, once heavy with pain, gradually became arenas for understanding, where grief coexisted with appreciation, and the children began to recognize the depth of care, guidance, and expectation that had defined the Reiner household. In these private, often silent moments, the Reiner siblings discovered that the stories, memories, and subtle teachings left behind by their parents constituted a form of wealth beyond measure. Though the fortune had been allocated elsewhere, the lessons of ethics, independence, and purpose remained as living legacies. They were learning, in real time and through lived experience, that inheritance can take forms beyond the material, and that the most enduring impact of a parent may be the cultivation of character and resilience in their children. Lessons that, once understood, could shape their lives in ways no fortune ever could. As the weeks stretched into months, Jake and Romy Reiner began to confront the profound lessons embedded within their parents' lives. The absence of material inheritance forced them to reflect not only on their own paths, but also on the enduring legacy of Rob and Michelle Singer Reiner. Every philanthropic initiative, every foundation, every film and advocacy project took on new significance, revealing a life philosophy that transcended conventional notions of wealth. Rob and Michelle had built a world in which influence, guidance, and purpose mattered more than possession, and their children were learning to recognize the subtle brilliance of this approach. The fortune that had once represented comfort now symbolized vision, the tangible proof of decades spent shaping society according to values that mattered deeply to them. The siblings' reflections extended beyond admiration for their parents' accomplishments. They grappled with the tension between personal desire and philosophical principle, the intimate cost of lessons that were communicated through absence rather than presence. Rob's insistence on independence, his belief that true growth required challenge and accountability, was a guiding ethos that had now become an active force in the lives of Jake and Romy. Each decision they made, each obstacle they faced, echoed the foundational principle that their parents had quietly instilled over decades: the value of resilience, the importance of self-determination, and the ultimate strength derived from facing life without reliance on external crutches. Romy began to see the interplay between personal grief and understanding. The emptiness left by the estate was painful, yet it was also a reflection of a lifetime of guidance and intention. She revisited countless evenings when Rob would discuss storytelling, integrity, and the power of narrative, framing life itself as a lesson in accountability and consequence. Michelle's meticulous work behind the scenes had demonstrated that true influence is measured not by recognition, but by the depth of impact and the lives touched. Romy realized that these daily, seemingly ordinary actions were in themselves a form of legacy, a blueprint for purposeful living that transcended financial inheritance. Jake, meanwhile, reflected on the interplay between principle and emotion. His initial frustration and anger had given way to a deeper comprehension of Rob's motivations. The decision to direct the fortune toward charitable causes was not an act of rejection, but a final, deliberate expression of parental faith in his children's ability to navigate the world independently. Each legal discussion, each review of trust structures, became not only a practical exercise, but also a meditation on the intersection of love, intention, and responsibility. Through the process, Jake began to recognize that the lessons of his upbringing were now being applied in real time. The capacity to confront challenge, to seek clarity, and to act with integrity without reliance on inherited advantage. The legacy of Rob and Michelle extended far beyond their family. Foundations such as I Am Your Child and Parents Action for Children had touched countless lives, reshaping understanding of early childhood development and social responsibility. Their advocacy for civil rights, marriage equality, and public education demonstrated the potency of combining influence with purpose. Romy and Jake were beginning to understand that these achievements were not merely professional milestones, but the tangible manifestation of values that had been woven into their daily lives: compassion, foresight, and a commitment to improving the world. The absence of personal inheritance was, in a sense, the ultimate application of these values, a deliberate choice to extend the principle of empowerment and independence to the next generation. As they reflected, both siblings came to see the paradox inherent in their parents' decision. The material absence, they felt, was a profound emotional test. It was also a demonstration of trust. Rob and Michelle had believed that the most enduring inheritance they could provide was not wealth, but the capacity to act with purpose, to think critically, and to navigate life with strength and ethical awareness. Jake and Romy were learning that grief and understanding could coexist, that resentment and respect could inhabit the same space, and that true legacy is measured not by assets alone, but by the values, lessons, and inspiration imparted. This period of reflection also led to a renewed appreciation for the courage and foresight of their parents. Rob's lifelong engagement with storytelling, whether through film, activism, or advocacy, had always been guided by principle. Each project, each philanthropic effort, had been designed to leave a meaningful imprint, to advance societal understanding, and to champion causes that aligned with their values. Michelle's strategic oversight ensured that these efforts were coherent, effective, and sustainable, demonstrating the subtle art of turning vision into lasting influence. The siblings began to see that their parents' lives were a series of interconnected acts of purpose, with each choice reinforcing the notion that character, integrity, and action matter more than material accumulation. Jake and Romy also reflected on the personal lessons embedded within the family structure itself. The quiet expectations, the nuanced guidance, the insistence on self-reliance, and the subtle modeling of ethical action all contributed to a framework that, while challenging to internalize in the moment, ultimately prepared them to face the complexities of life. The absence of material wealth was now contextualized within this broader narrative. It was a deliberate, final lesson in autonomy, a manifestation of the principles that had guided them since childhood. Each moment of doubt, frustration, or sorrow was reframed as a step in understanding and embodying the very values their parents had exemplified. In private conversation, Romy would remark on the complexity of their inheritance, the ways in which love, philosophy, and societal responsibility had been intertwined. Jake, reflecting on his own path, began to internalize that success and meaning were defined not by what is received, but by how one engages with life, with work, and with the responsibilities entrusted to each individual. The absence of material inheritance became a catalyst for self-examination, prompting both siblings to assess their own principles, ambitions, and capacities for independent action. Ultimately, the Reiner legacy was revealed not in bank accounts or property deeds, but in the principles and actions that had shaped generations. The charitable foundations, the films, the advocacy, and the ethical framework Rob and Michelle had meticulously cultivated constituted a wealth far more enduring than dollars or real estate. Jake and Romy began to understand that the true inheritance was the capacity to live purposefully, to act with integrity, and to navigate a complex world with the lessons of their upbringing as guidance. The journey from grief to comprehension illuminated the depth of Rob and Michelle's vision. That the most lasting legacy a parent can provide is the ability to stand alone, act ethically, and live with purpose, even in the absence of material support. In the months that followed, the finality of their parents' choices settled into the rhythms of daily life for Jake and Romy Reiner. The Brentwood home, once vibrant with presence and guidance, now stood quiet, its walls echoing with memories and absence. Yet within this silence lay a profound lesson, slowly crystallizing in the minds of the siblings. The true essence of Rob and Michelle's legacy was not measured in dollars, property, or material comfort, but in the enduring principles, the moral framework, and the quiet guidance they had instilled over a lifetime. Each step forward became an exercise in understanding how love can manifest through action, philosophy, and trust rather than tangible inheritance. Jake found himself reflecting on the paradox of loss and empowerment. The initial shock, the feeling of being excluded, and the anger that had flared in the early weeks had gradually softened into contemplation. He recognized that his parents had intended for him to navigate life with independence, resilience, and personal accountability, and that the absence of financial inheritance was a final lesson in these enduring values. Each decision he made, each challenge he confronted, became a testament to the education he had received through years of subtle guidance, observation, and expectation. Romy, too, immersed herself in creative and professional pursuits, drawing upon the principles her parents had lived by, translating lessons of diligence, empathy, and integrity into her own work and interactions with the world. Even in the quietest moments, when the world had moved on and public attention had waned, the emotional echoes remained. Romy would walk through the rooms where childhood laughter had once filled the air, allowing memories to surface, embracing both sorrow and understanding. The photographs on the walls, the letters tucked away in drawers, and the remnants of family life served as reminders that love is often communicated in subtle, indirect ways. These reflections illuminated the depth of their parents' intention to cultivate character, purpose, and independence rather than provide comfort through material means. The absence of inheritance became a lens through which they could measure the depth and integrity of Rob and Michelle's philosophy. A philosophy lived consistently over decades and now crystallized in their final act. The charitable foundations, the advocacy projects, and the societal initiatives championed by their parents stood as monuments to values that transcended personal wealth. The I Am Your Child Foundation, the Parents Action for Children Initiative, and campaigns for equality in education were tangible expressions of the ethical principles their parents had embraced, blending vision, foresight, and compassion into enduring impact. Jake and Romy increasingly recognized that these contributions reflected a form of love that extended beyond the private sphere, demonstrating that legacy is not simply a measure of what one leaves behind, but of the principles and influence one embeds in the lives of others. Each act of philanthropy, each campaign, and each carefully considered initiative was a lesson in ethical action, persistence, and societal responsibility, offering the siblings a model for engaging with the world in a meaningful way. The process of understanding their parents' intentions required not only reflection, but also emotional reconciliation. The pain of exclusion, the sense of being left out of a tangible narrative of inheritance, and the moments of frustration and anger were all elements of an emotional journey that demanded recognition. Romy and Jake had to confront the reality that love does not always align with expectation, that parental intent can be expressed through principle rather than possession, and that the deepest gifts are often those that challenge rather than comfort. Through these reflections, they began to perceive the breadth of Rob and Michelle's vision. That true guidance, true legacy, is conveyed through empowering others to stand on their own, to act with integrity, and to live with purpose. In the quiet spaces of thought and memory, the siblings came to understand that grief and appreciation could coexist. The absence of financial inheritance, once a source of profound hurt, gradually became a reminder of the trust their parents had placed in them, a manifestation of the lessons imparted over years of upbringing. Every choice they now faced, every challenge, and every responsibility was infused with the ethos their parents had cultivated. The realization that wealth had been intentionally directed towards societal good rather than personal comfort illuminated the magnitude of Rob and Michelle's vision, and the siblings began to internalize the significance of a legacy measured not in dollars, but in enduring principles. As the siblings contemplated their parents' impact, they recognized the duality of inheritance: the public legacy of philanthropy and advocacy, and the private legacy of moral guidance and life lessons. The foundation of this dual inheritance was consistent, coherent, and deeply intentional, reflecting a lifelong commitment to purpose over possession. Jake and Romy increasingly understood that the most valuable lessons were those that could not be measured in material terms: the capacity to navigate life independently, to act ethically, and to apply the principles of integrity and responsibility in every decision. Each day became an exercise in embodying the values their parents had modeled, translating grief and reflection into purposeful action. In the end, the Reiner legacy revealed itself as a balance between societal impact and personal growth. Rob and Michelle had dedicated their lives to causes larger than themselves, shaping society and influencing countless lives, while simultaneously cultivating the character, resilience, and independence of their own children. The absence of inheritance was not an erasure of love, but a deliberate choice, a final act of guidance that underscored the depth of their principles. Jake and Romy learned that the essence of legacy lies not in wealth or possession, but in the cultivation of values, the capacity to confront life's challenges, and the ability to translate lessons into meaningful action. In this understanding, the siblings found a measure of solace, a framework for continuing their parents' vision, and a recognition that the most profound inheritance is the knowledge, ethics, and resilience embedded in the next generation. Even as the world celebrated Rob and Michelle's philanthropy, Jake and Romy internalized a more personal understanding that love, guidance, and lasting impact are often expressed through absence, through challenge, and through trust in the capability of those we care for most. The Reiner legacy, complex and multifaceted, had prepared them for a life of purpose and independence, a lesson etched not in currency, but in the enduring values that their parents had lived, taught, and ultimately embodied through their final choices.